Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning, good afternoon from Bangkok. A warm welcome to all, and thank you for joining us today at this important dialogue, one that will help us shape the future of regional cooperation in our region, Asia Pacific. This is a regional dialogue with global implications. During the COVID-19 pandemic and even before, the eyes of the world have been on our region as the engine of global growth, as the poverty reduction success story of our generation, and as the emerging technology frontline. It would not have gone unnoticed that the same applies to confronting the COVID-19 pandemic as our countries, ranging from New Zealand to Vietnam and Thailand, lead the world in effective pandemic response. Even this success cannot mask the fact that we are in the midst of an unprecedented socio-economic crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has set the region and the world back at least a decade in terms of development gains. We know that the costs from the economic slowdown will have significant negative impacts on both economic and social development across the region. Yet, it has also provided new opportunities and perhaps a new resolve to abandon business as usual and change in direction. The pandemic has also brought into sharp focus where this change in direction may be needed most. The indications are all around us to see. Underinvestment in public healthcare system that have left many unprepared to serve people's ordinary needs, let alone the needs arising from a pandemic. People unprotected and lacking access to basic social protection that leaves them vulnerable to any shock. Millions of workers are locked into working in the informal sector with little hope for progress and no safety net to fall back on. Lack of access to proper digital infrastructure to cope with new modalities in work and education, leaving countless workers out of work and more than 200 million school children out of remote learning programs. The pandemic has also been a wake-up call to realize the value of interconnectedness, something that is inherent in our DNA of our region, Asia Pacific. Regional connectivity in trade, transport, energy, and ICT in particular is a fundamental building block of our region's progress. As borders temporarily closed and transport was hampered, there was a reminder of how important neighbors are for livelihood and the value of our regional integration mission that has extended over 70 years. But another form of interconnectedness was also revealed, the intimate connection between humans and nature. COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease that traces back to what the UN Secretary General has called our war against nature. And the front lines of that war is here in Asia and the Pacific, where we emit the majority of the world's greenhouse gas and breathe the most polluted air, where we send the largest quantities of untreated waste and plastic into the sea and ocean, where much of the illegal wildlife trade begins or ends up, and where environmental destruction is leaving our people more vulnerable than ever. The development models that have underpinned our region's progress so far have shown to be inadequate to deliver inclusive, resilient, and sustainable development, and clearly unable to make our countries and people more resilient in the face of shocks and pandemics. As we rise from the impact from the pandemic and grapple with what the future should look like, one thing is clear. We need to start valuing what matters, our people and our planet, and start treating planetary and people's well-being as a common and inseparable goal. So, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, with that background, this dialogue provides an opportunity to explore various aspects of development potential and opportunities of our region. Allow me now to convey the following objectives of this dialogue. First, to provide an opportunity to share initial ideas or priority areas and how to advance regional cooperation and certainly SDGs. The dialogue will enable multi-stakeholders to express their observations and views for further consideration on these priority areas. The dialogue will also serve as a platform to discuss the future of regional cooperation and multilateralism as the region navigates the development pathways to address COVID-19 recovery and beyond, climate emergencies, while harnessing technological innovation and ICT. In view of this, what does recovery from COVID-19 pandemic and beyond mean for the Asia-Pacific region? What are the implications of this for our countries and our institutions? That is what we are hoping to discuss with our eminent panel today, a dialogue that will take us all the way to the Commission session next year, 2022, as we celebrate or mark the ESCAP 75th anniversary. In this context, we are very much honored to have three distinguished thought leaders from our region with us to share their insights today. First, we are delighted to have Honorable Helen Clark, who was the 37th Prime Minister of New Zealand and former administrator of UNDP. She is currently the co-chair of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, which was established by WHO DG in response to the World Health Assembly Resolution 73.1. And we are also pleased to have Mr. Masatsugu Asakawa, President of ADB, and the Chairperson of ADB's Board of Directors, as well as my good friend, His Excellency Mr. Marty Natalagawa. Pak Marty is former Foreign Minister of Indonesia, former PR, Ambassador of Indonesia to the UN in New York. Pak Marty is currently a member of UN Secretary General's high-level panel or high-level advisory board on mediation. I'm very much looking forward to your reflections, thoughts, deliberation on shaping the future of regional cooperation in Asia and Pacific. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our first speaker, Helen Clark. Helen, of course, without no need here for introduction, you have had an exceptional career leading national government, leading a multilateral institution, UNDP. So just two quick questions. What do you think are the major challenges and opportunities to sustainable development in our region? Of course, during this pandemic and especially beyond. And second, how the UN in general and in particular ESCAP could further contribute. Over to you, Helen.
Well, thank you so much, Executive Secretary, and great to see you on screen, and also my colleague Marty, who I worked so closely with in his former capacities. And greetings to all excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, gathered for this very important high-level dialogue. ESCAP does play an essential role in our region of the Asia-Pacific, providing platforms for dialogue and as a source of technical expertise on how our region can work together to boost the development prospects of us all. Now, as ESCAP approaches its 75th anniversary next year, the need for its work and its platforms are as great as ever, because the challenges to sustainable development are great, and they are made much more complicated by so-called black swan events like this current pandemic that we are living through. But an issue for debate is, should it have been a black swan event? Could we have been better prepared? And I'll come back to that in the course of my remarks. But also take as a starting point what the Executive Secretary just said. This is a chance for a reset. It is a chance where we've reflected, we've seen what's gone wrong, we can resolve to do things better. Out of crisis always comes opportunity if we can seize that a moment. Let me start, though, with a note of optimism. Of course, the pace of human development, poverty reduction, economic development in our region has been huge. The region has stood out for the pace of development, and it's had so many resources to draw on. It's human resources, and of course it's growing financial resources as well. And the spirit which has enabled the Asia Pacific to succeed largely to date can also propel it forward in the future. But what I think is widely accepted, as the Executive Secretary implied in her opening remarks, is that the fast development trajectory in our region has come at a high price. And that, of course, is not unique to our part of the world. Globally, the natural resources of our planet have been treated as if they were in infinite supply. I think it was Prime Minister Gordon Brown who once said, we're living as though we had 3 to 4 planets to draw from, and we only have one. And now we're so acutely aware of having stepped over or come very close to the edge of a number of planetary boundaries. For example, but not limited to, our climate ecosystem. We worry about our tropical forests, our oceans, our freshwater systems, our glaciers, our biodiversity, our air quality. These and more have been under great pressure. And great as the pressure on those natural systems is, and fast as the rising levels of human development have been in our region, yet we are still not close to eradicating poverty. And in one of the excellent background papers I've seen for this dialogue, we see the updated figures that 1.2 billion people in our region live on under $3.2 a day, and another 2.2 billion live on under $5.5 a day. What is very clear is we can't overcome those levels of poverty on the old models of development without creating as many as or more problems than we're trying to solve now. In saying this, I'm so mindful of a UNDP Global Human Development report of a decade ago, which postulated that on worst-case scenarios for growth and inequality and continuing environmental degradation, human development globally could slow to a crawl and even regress in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. This is not the future we want. So if it's not the future we want, we have to do things differently. We are at a tipping point. We can course correct towards sustainable development on actions, not just words. If we do, we can stop the further erosion of major human development gains that we've made. That tipping point means if we don't change, we won't have a prospect of improving the lives of those who still remain poor and marginalised. So, as we course correct towards sustainable development, we have to ensure that it really is sustainable also in the sense of being durable. I recall in the lead up to the Sendai conference, which produced the very important framework on disaster risk reduction, saying so often, informed by UNDP, that if our development isn't risk informed, it cannot be sustainable development, because we simply need one of these black swan events to wipe away the gains that we've made, whether it's a tsunami, whether it's any natural disaster, and of course now, as we know, with a pandemic. We can go backwards fast if our development is not risk-informed and we're not risk-prepared. And unfortunately, the lack of risk-informed development, preparedness, response mechanisms, and whole-of-government coordination has been telling around the world in a lot of countries. Yes, the Asia-Pacific, many countries have done much better than the global average, and I'm proud to live in one myself. But even so, we know we could have been better prepared and we could have done better. We've seen our health systems in many cases really struggle under pressure. We've seen the education of our children and young people terribly disrupted, gaps that may never be made up. There will be children, particularly girl children, who never get back to school. We've seen, as you said, Executive Secretary, the rising poverty levels, hunger levels have risen as a result of what's happened with the pandemic. Our economies, every economy has been put under pressure, my own included. We carry debt levels now that we would have had nightmares about when I was a Prime Minister 2 decades ago. And yet what was the alternative? Not to provide the supports the society and the economy needed. In saying we can all do better, we don't have to reinvent the wheel on agendas. We have all the great agendas of 2015, all of them internationally agreed. We need to embrace them, embrace their spirit and put them into action at the center of our regional and national endeavors. And let the direction charted by the Sendai framework play a more prominent role. It often seemed to be a bit in the background with the very important SDGs and Paris Climate Agreement. And I think Sendai was often sort of thought of, oh, well, that's natural disaster risk reduction. But actually, what was groundbreaking about Sendai was that it did incorporate health hazards, which the Hyogo framework before it had not adequately incorporated. And the WHO analysis tells us that in the Sendai framework, there are more than 30 explicit references to health. And I quote, referring to the implementation of an all hazards approach to managing disaster risk, including links to epidemics and pandemics, several references to the International Health Regulations of 2005, and to rehabilitation as part of disaster recovery. So it is time for a reset based on Sendai, the SDGs Agenda 2030 framework, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for development. We need to lift ambition on the Paris commitments. We need to boost investment now in our green energy, transport, cities, our approaches to waste. We need to boost investment in our forest protection and restoration, in our climate-friendly agriculture. And also, Executive Secretary, you made the very important point about the links to wildlife conservation and biodiversity. Zoonotic diseases have been around forever and a day. In today's interconnected world, they have the capacity, as we've seen with COVID, to take off and do tremendous damage. So a new respect for nature, nature-based solutions, respect for our biodiversity has to be an important part of the reset. And of course, we still, I understand, have the delayed COP for the Biodiversity Convention to come. And we need to be joining all these dots because so often we do things in silos. Our conservation people go to the biodiversity COP, our climate people go to the climate change one, our health people go to the World Health Assembly, development experts to the World Bank and so on. We have to have joined up approaches. Now, if I could perhaps conclude my comments by just making some reflections on key learnings, I think, from COVID in the health and social areas. And they would be as follows: that it's shown a clear need for reform in pandemic preparedness and health system resilience. And I've already referred to this. We need a standby capacity, regionally, globally, nationally, for pandemic preparedness. We need flexible, adaptable plans. We need our public health infrastructure invested in. Often, it goes a bit by the by as people focus on treatments. We need to go back to basics, primary healthcare, preparedness, testing and tracing, having our systems for communication with our publics at top level, our capacities for quarantine and isolation, the key messaging about social distancing, masking, all of these things. And not wanting to sound overly bleak, but that the longer this transmission goes on and the more variants develop, I think any thought of seeing vaccines as a simple panacea, it's too simplistic. Vaccine is a very important tool, but it will need an equitable rollout, which we're not seeing yet, and we must keep our public defences up. A second lesson is that universal health coverage is absolutely needed to face these kinds of threats and for all sorts of other reasons. And it must reach every corner of a country with no questions asked. If our health systems exclude marginalized people, whoever they may be, they may include undocumented workers, migrant workers in general, the poor, the discriminated against. Wherever there's exclusion, people don't come forward. And if you don't come forward for testing and case identification in a pandemic, it's a disaster. So health for all isn't just a mantra. It's an absolute necessity for our economies, our societies, and for health and well-being. A third lesson, and sort of flowing from that, is we have to attack the health inequalities and their social determinants. We know that those with poor health status have been hit the hardest by COVID. Multidimensional poverty encompasses health vulnerabilities, and these must be addressed at a societal level. Put very bluntly, poverty is very bad for health. Lesson 4, for a strong pandemic response, as for all the other reasons we know, we need universal social protection. Some of the most heartbreaking accounts that I saw in our media when the lockdowns began was from people in very poor communities who said, I'm going to die of hunger before I die of COVID. Around 4 billion people in our world lack access to even the most basic social protection. And yet ILO, which has done groundbreaking work on social protection, including the study that was led by Michelle Bachelet, now Human Rights Commissioner, says that it can be provided for a fraction of GDP, something a little over 1% of GDP will provide basic social protection. We need those systems working, and they're a critical tool in fighting a pandemic like this. My fifth lesson really is do fund regional and global health infrastructure properly and give it the powers it needs to do the job it needs to do. I say that in global health, what has happened with the pandemic is rather like the Chernobyl moment for nuclear safety. Out of the Chernobyl tragedy came a level of information and experience sharing between countries we'd never seen before, new powers for the International Atomic Energy Agency on access and inspection, and a new convention. I think the global health system needs to seize the moment of this pandemic and say, this is the time to make the changes needed. And I do think strong regional institutions on communicable disease control are important too. We rely on regions so much today to do so much. They're an essential part of the apparatus. So those would be some of my reflections. And can I just underline again, and perhaps something for the Asia-Pacific region to think about as the global level is clearly struggling. We need an equitable approach to vaccine rollout. It's not good enough for my country, for other high-income countries, to vaccinate everybody in the course of this year and think, oh, well, that's done and dusted. That is not in our interests. It won't protect us as long as others are unprotected. We have to stop transmission. And where it's raging anywhere, it has, of course, the clear potential, as already shown, for new variants to emerge and for then our vaccine responses exist to be suboptimal, and we're constantly adapting and innovating. It is a nightmare. So any thought the Asia-Pacific has about how to support the equitable allocation of vaccines and diagnostics and therapeutics, I think would be extremely useful. I hope those thoughts have been helpful to the dialogue today.
Thank you very much, Helena, for a very comprehensive and many insight, including starting with that development has to be risk-informed. Yeah, I think that is the key word, risk-informed, whether with regard to natural disaster, pandemic, and etc. And also you touch on the importance, or now is the opportunity, the time of this reset, changing course of direction, but taking several, references such as Sendai framework, SDGs for sure, Paris Climate Agreement, Addis Ababa financing development, as the anchor, and in my note, five key lessons from COVID, from the reform in pandemic preparedness and health to the last one is also the funding, to fund the regional global infrastructure properly, And last is how Asia Pacific can also support the equitable approach to vaccination. Again, thank you very much, Helen. And now let me turn to our second speaker, who is Mr. Masatsugu Asakawa, who is the president of Asian Development Bank. Although he's not able to join us live this morning, but he already sent his pre-recorded video message where he will share his perspectives and also ideas. Can I ask the video?
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Asian Development Bank, it is my pleasure to join you today for this important dialogue on shaping the future of regional cooperation in Asia and the Pacific. COVID-19 threatens to reverse the region's hard-won development gains. While uncertainties around the pandemic remain substantial, vaccines offer great promise to reduce the health and economic impact and allow for a faster return to some normalcy in economic and social activity. As our economies face an uncertain path to recovery, regional cooperation becomes more important than ever. Let me highlight three key areas where stronger regional cooperation is essential to help combat the challenges of the pandemic and build for lasting recovery. First, we need to stronger regional cooperation to build resilience, especially against health security risks. Cooperation is essential to improve overall regional health security by strengthening health systems, improving coordination among national regulators and surveillance agencies, and ensuring real-time monitoring and exchange of information on emerging outbreaks. ADB's ongoing Greater Mekong Sub-region Health Security Project has helped improve regional cooperation and communicable disease control in border areas, and strengthened disease surveillance and outbreak response systems of GMS countries. Ensuring access to safe and effective vaccines for all people, including the poor and the vulnerable, also requires cooperation among countries. Since vaccines are a global public good, we need to mobilize and deploy resources through a multilateral approach instead of leaving everything to individual countries. ADB, through its $9 billion new vaccine initiative, the Asia Pacific Vaccine Access Facility, or APVAX, has been working closely with COVAX, WHO, World Bank, and other multilateral institutions to deliver safe and effective vaccines fairly and equitably. Second, we must restore strong trade, deep regional supply chains, and vibrant investment, which have been a major driving force behind the other region's rapid growth and economic transformation. Despite border closures and travel restrictions, I believe economies will reopen and reconnect soon. The signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, in November 2020 signaled our region's commitment to open trade and investment. Building on this renewed commitment, we must ensure that the benefits reach low-income, land or sea-locked countries, small businesses, and the poor and vulnerable. To do this, ADB has ramped up its trade and supply chain finance programs. To date, these programs mobilized $5.8 billion and helped many SMEs to participate in global trade and supply chains, especially during this period of disruption caused by the pandemic. We also remain committed to better trade facilitation, which includes implementing paperless trade, improving digital trade standards, and supporting capacity building initiatives. Third, the pandemic has pushed many economies into fiscal deficits and higher debt. Because governments will have to eventually restore their fiscal sustainability, we need to strengthen domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation. Regional cooperation can address this important need. It can be especially effective in helping to close the tax loopholes that some multinational corporations take advantage of. The issue has become more challenging as the economy have moved towards increased digitalization because of COVID-19 mobility restrictions. Large and growing markets, especially in Asia and the Pacific, are increasingly drawing investment from multinational corporations. We need to ensure these corporations pay their fair share of taxes by closing the loopholes. Last September, ADB established a regional hub for domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation. The hub will serve as a platform for countries and development partners to exchange ideas, knowledge, and best practices, and to better coordinate their actions. We plan to officially launch this hub at a high-level regional tax conference this coming May. Let me conclude by assuring you that ADB stands ready to support all these efforts through stronger regional cooperation so that we can overcome our common challenges. Let me also make it clear that ADB will not waver in our commitment to achieving the goals stated in our Strategy 2030, such as tackling climate change, addressing poverty and the worsening income gap, ensuring gender equity, and enhancing environmental sustainability. We know that recovery and continued progress towards inclusive and sustainable growth are within reach, and that our friendship and cooperation will ensure that we will get there together. Thank you.
If I may just quickly again reiterate the three areas for stronger regional cooperation that Masa-san alluded. First is build resilience against health security risk, in which the elements of strengthening the healthcare system as well as the rolling out of this vaccination, in which Asia Pacific contributing also in this process. Second, restore strong trade, deepening regional supply chain and vibrant investment, which again are or have been the backbone of economic or development progress in our region. Third is again how to mitigate these fiscal deficits and looming debt. And again, from the angle of again the priority of restoring fiscal sustainability, which is of course is not a short-term agenda, but also a medium long-term agenda, with a particular focus on domestic resource mobilization and international tax cooperation. Okay, with that, now I would like and very pleased to invite Pak Marty. Pak Marty. Again, we've heard, we've been following that this COVID-19 pandemic is the pretext for accentuating many of the structural development challenges of our region. Its transboundary scale and looming threats, are putting the role of multilateralism, including in this case regionalism, at stake. And of course, Pak Marty as a diplomat, long-standing career in foreign policy in driving multilateral cooperation forward, and we look to you to understand the present and future multilateral relations at play in our region and how we can advance this further forward. Yeah. So, Pak Marty, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Executive Secretary. I'm truly delighted and humbled by the invitation extended to me by yourself to this important dialogue. I'm especially pleased that I'm sharing a platform with Helen, whose contribution to our regions, not only her own country's progress, but also to the region's welfare has been enormous, and I wish to pay tribute to that. ESCAP, as I understand it, next year will celebrate its 75th year. What a transformative contributions ESCAP has made to Asia and the Pacific. Our region has gone through tremendous transformation, which we don't need to go into great detail, but at the same time, I think all of us are in recognition that while progress have been made, there continue to be challenges ahead of us. And I think the remarks earlier alluded to that and recognized those continued challenges, made even clearer by the pandemic that we are at the moment grappling with. When I reflect on the Asia and the Pacific, especially its regional architecture, I come to recognize and is of the view that ours is not a region bereft of regional cooperative networks. We have, while we may not have an overarching Asia-Pacific framework, at the same time we have a tremendous amount and complex network of processes in play, whether it be part of the UN family, whether it be the Bretton Woods system, whether it be, for instance, the one that I'm most familiar with, the ASEAN-led or ASEAN initiative processes. In other words, the main point is our region, Asia and the Pacific, is one that is home to a complex network of intra-regional and inter-regional cooperation that has been built over time in a very step-by-step function-driven probably approach as well. But the question is, what of the future? How can we ensure a future shape of regional cooperation that is fit for purpose for 21st century challenges? I think this is one key questions that we must try to address to ensure that notwithstanding the wonderfully and important work that various regional processes have undertaken, can we have a real consideration to what extent these processes remain fit for purpose for 21st century type of challenge? And I think the COVID-19, the pandemic, reminds us of so many implications that make such a reflection all the more important. For certain, I believe that when we look back to this era, to this period, we will recognize that the COVID-19, the pandemic, has been or is era-defining, epoch-defining. I think henceforth we will look back and define our activities in a pre-COVID, COVID, and hopefully post-COVID environment. And just now, we have heard so many different facets and implications of the pandemic of COVID, to which I simply would like to emphasize and make reference to in the first part of my remarks, if I may. The first obvious and self-evident implications of the COVID pandemic is obviously in the public health domain. And just now, Helen has spoken eloquently and forcefully on the issue, and I'm especially endorse and recognize the idea of ensuring health for all. I think that is equitable health access to all, I think is a timely reminder for us to make a more urgent response. The public health dimension, both direct as well as indirect, the economic dimension. Here, I think in this platform, we wish to emphasize the differentiated impacts of the pandemic to the most vulnerable members of our community, how the pandemic has caused setback in various efforts to address poverty alleviation and concerns of that type. Not only public health, not only to the economy, we are reminded of the nexus or the linkage between the pandemic and the environment. And this is, I think it humbles us all to recognize how fragile and how respectful we must be of the environment, of our own limitations, and how we can ensure activities that are more sustainable and respectful of nature and the environment. Besides public health, economy, and the environment, the education field, public education is being affected by the pandemic. Millions of children are unable to attend school. I know that nowadays we make a great deal of emphasis on how the information technology, digital solutions have provided communication possibilities. But at the same time, I think for millions, the pandemic, the fact that schools are being closed and digital platform being accentuated, in a way, it's also accentuating digital divide. Let's ensure that let's be mindful of the potential impact on children's educations that will be many years in its full manifestation. The nature of work have been affected as well, and not least of all, and an issue that I wish to perhaps delve on today, is the impact on geopolitics and diplomacy, implications on governance and human rights. I think when we look all around us, the pandemic has heightened, while it is a global phenomenon, and none of us are immune and can escape the situation. The responses by governments have varied. Which governments have placed science at the forefront, knowledge-based response, and which have tended less to. And I think we can see the implications of policy choices governments make in response to this pandemic. In other words, the pandemic, besides the impact on public health, the economy, on environment, public education, on technology, it also has plenty of lessons to be learned in terms of governance and in terms of even the subject I wanted to go into on multilateralism and diplomacy. On multilateralism, this is the second bit of my short remarks. Clearly, the pandemic constitutes a litmus test. It is a litmus test. On the one hand, obviously, the pandemic reminds us of the promise and the potential of multilateralism. The pandemic reminds us that there are issues out there that defies national solution. However much governments may think that they can somehow have a magic bullet or magic wand to be able to, a silver bullet or magic wand to solve these problems nationally. Actually, it requires cooperative partnership. And given its multifaceted implications, it requires a multilateral response as well to ensure a solution for one doesn't create new problems in other domains as well. In other words, if ever there is a circumstance or situation where we can speak favorably for multilateralism, this would be it. But I think many of us in our honest moments, more honest and more frank moments, would also come to realize or recognize that that reality, how pandemic and multilateralism, how the pandemic reinforce the importance of multilateralism. At the same time, we are seeing contrarian dynamics or dynamics to the contrary to what should be. We are seeing how multilateral cooperation have been affected by geopolitical rivalries, independent of the pandemic challenge. In other words, geopolitical rivalries of the purest power political kind is being transplanted, being projected to functional cooperations. Even institutions such as the WHO have not been immune from the vagaries of geopolitical rivalries and the push and the pull when science should be at the forefront. Instead, political considerations and becomes more at the forefront. Besides geopolitical dynamics, I think all of us must recognize and must be humble enough to acknowledge that there's been unilateral instincts within countries, by countries. It's not only the so-called major powers that have been bereft of leadership in some of these issues, but almost without exception, countries have adopted a more country-first approach. Vaccine nationalism is a phenomenon that have been mentioned on a number of occasions. Failing to recognize the idea that no one is safe until everyone is safe. But somehow, the unilateralist national first instinct is difficult to address or difficult to manage. Hence, we are at the same time, we are seeing within the national dynamics certain sense of impatience by the multilateral approach. Multilateral approach is deemed to be the painstaking efforts that is involved in diplomacy is described as is seen to be slow, is described or seen to be not sufficiently cash and carry and immediate of its implications and consequence. In other words, I think while on the one hand, the pandemic should justify and reinforce the importance of multilateral response, at the same time, if we are honest enough and frank and candid, we must recognize and acknowledge that there are out there contrarian dynamics, geopolitical dynamics, and the national unilateral dynamic as well. And not least of all, I think the pandemic at the other end of the spectrum reminds or poses the question, when we speak of multilateralism, is it more of an international character, interstate, or is it of a global character? In terms of we must liberate ourselves in thinking about when we speak of multilateral cooperation, what are its shape and form? Wouldn't colleagues agree that some of the most important advances, positive contributions that have been made over the past 1 year have been in the area of vaccines development? These are science-led efforts by entities within governments working cross-border, coming up with solutions. Surely, when we speak of multilateralism for the 21st century, space must be given for such entities, such expertise to be brought to the fore at the earliest possibility. My third and final point on the future of regional cooperation in the Asia Pacific. I don't believe we have institutional deficit. The Asia and the Pacific is home to several regional processes that I have briefly alluded to at the beginning. I don't believe that there is any obvious vacuum or gaps in our region. And I don't believe there is also even a lack of awareness of the challenges, because all of us are capable of identifying what are the problems, what are the challenges, especially post-pandemic. And thankfully, thanks to the leadership of colleagues at the UN and other international bodies, we also have the blueprint what's ahead of us. The SDG so comprehensively and yet so succinctly encapsulates what are the issues that we need to be putting all our efforts in. So we are not bereft of institutional capacities. We are not bereft of agenda. We know what the agenda are, and now accentuated by the pandemic. If there is any challenge, I believe, is more of how we can promote greater coherence, greater coordinations, a greater whole system approach. Because I'm sure if one was to look at the agenda of all these various wonderful instruments and processes, ASEAN, the UN family, the Bretton Woods system, etc., a number of common themes would appear. And I think it would be wonderful and important for all the stakeholders to sit together and to compare notes what each are doing in the same area, so that we are not reinventing the wheel. There is no silo outlook. We compare notes, we promote effectiveness and efficiency, and etc. Those are the more, and of course, ASEAN and UN is one example, I think. And Helen, you would recall it was during when you served as the UN in UNDP. That was a very defining moment for the promotion of ASEAN-UN cooperation. So I think in terms of process, I don't believe that there is any institutional deficit. In terms of issues, I don't think there is any issues deficit in terms of recognitions. We know what are the tasks, we know what are the challenges. If there is space for improvement, for enhanced capacity, I believe it would be in promoting greater coherence and greater coordination and communication between all the well-intentioned efforts by the different frameworks. But since we are in a hopefully framework, I believe that it's important for us to go beyond procedural and response. And I hope the ESCAP can be part of a conversation, an effort to begin a deeper conversation for what multilateralism for the 21st century actually entails. Because I feel sometimes, now that I have more time to reflect on such matters, but I feel that there is a key challenge on how to promote a greater sense of ownership and participation in all these efforts. All these efforts are tremendously important, etc., but how can we ensure that all stakeholders feel that they are invested in it, that they are able to contribute, they're able to participate? What are the best structure, the best governance structure to allow for this to happen, not to simply have business as usual approach? I think we are challenged to define a new type of regional multilateralism that provides for greater sense of ownership and participation by stakeholders. And that reflects, in my view, the challenge of how to adapt with change. Not only geopolitical changes, power shifts and power dynamics. How can we ensure a multilateral system that has an automatic adaptive capacity, that doesn't simply snapshot and freeze frame an existing power equation, but allows countries with capacity to contribute to actually contribute. New Zealand, for instance, if I may, Helen, is an example of a country, probably based on a regular type of power index, would appear somewhere, wherever it is. I don't want to say, but in terms of impact on pandemic, it has done tremendously well. It has a lot to share with all of us. And my final point, Bu Armida, is how to manage the national and international nexus. Bu Armida, in your previous capacity in our national planning agency in Indonesia, you would probably recognize, I'm sure recognize, that a lot of commitments made at the global and regional levels must be mainstreamed into national plans and national efforts. And here I think is a challenge for all involved, how to ensure that there is no divisions or disconnect between all the wonderful commitments, whether it be on the environment, on pandemic, on the health domain, and actual national priorities. And I think to bridge the national and the international is an extremely important task. In other words, it is not only consolidation among the regional organizations, regional processes, but not least of all, we must consolidate and synergize the national and the international as well. And of course, amidst it all, the role of diplomacy is primary and at the forefront within those efforts. Those are some of the thoughts I wanted to share, Bu Armida, Bu Helen, and I hope that's been useful, but I look forward very much to our conversation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Marty, for again, you touch on first by your observation, which also I think shared by the previous speakers on the impact of this pandemic, the economic, of course, health, social and economic impact, which are tremendous, but open up the opportunity of digitalization and so on, in which our region is at the forefront of all this initiative and innovation. And then, of course, the very important question that we would like you to address is on this multilateralism, including at the regional level, our region, especially Asia Pacific. You touch on a very, very interesting observation, despite that this is the promise of potential, the pandemics, for greater, more coherent and closer cooperation, international cooperation, multilateralism, and yet what we see is, in some instances, of course, is on the contrary, right? And also some unilateral action by countries. But the big question is still there, Pak Marty. The big question is still there: how to advance regional cooperation in Asia Pacific. During pandemic, but we would like also to actually go a little bit beyond, post-pandemic, on all this preparedness, risk-based planning, and so on and so forth. So if I may, I would like to combine, we've received several questions from the floor, but of course we cannot entertain all in one by one. If I may, I just want to group it, and group all the questions and link that with your remarks, both Helen and Pak Marty. So if I may just combine it, I would like to now come back to Helen. What would be your further thoughts? Again, hearing from Pak Marty, and you, with all your rich experience, and now you're in this WHO panel, exactly, how to advance this. Of course, we understand all these references, SDG, Sendai, and so on and so forth, but oftentimes, to be effective, right, then you need, if I may say, you need to navigate, right, your way in order to be effective, especially in terms of regional cooperation and the challenges that we pose and the direction. We want to recover better. We want to recover better, and all this element is there. But then how? And more on the how. So can I ask you, Helen, for your reaction on the discussion so far? Over to you, Helen.
Thank you. And responding to Marty's very interesting reflections on multilateralism, I think I probably have three reflections to add. Firstly, clearly, the pandemic shows that we need multilateral and regional cooperation. We are facing a challenge that no one country can solve. That was the very reason for ever forming international organizations, the recognition that we have shared challenges, we can't tackle them on our own, we need a effective working institutions above the level of the nation state. Now, in a sense, the pandemic is also an opportunity to reinvigorate multilateralism. Because if we can't get it right, when each of us as a human being faces an existential threat, when could we ever get it right? And, we're just at a point in time now with a new American administration, which is re-engaging fully with the multilateral system, where there's a window, I think, for those who never abandoned the hopes for multilateralism, for us all to come back together again and say, look, we can't stumble on as we were. Let's try and get it right in health. Let's fill the gaps in our systems, regulations, treaties, preparedness, financing, the rest of it. Let's try and get it right in health. And then take that spirit. I think you get a spillover. If you can have success somewhere, you can leverage it for other things as well. That's the first reflection. The second reflection I'd make is really building on Marty's comments about really needing perhaps a new, more inclusive multilateralism. And there are examples out there. I share a couple of such examples where they're not UN organizations, but they are global organizations. One of them is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which Indonesia itself is a member of, and other countries in the region. And that is a partnership made up of governments, well over 50 now, implementing a good governance standard in the extractive industry sector. It's made up of the major companies in oil, gas, and minerals, particularly the Western companies. It would be good to see a wider range. And then it's made up of global civil society. And at each level then, the national level, you have multi-stakeholder groups that mirror that partnership. Now, I think there's something to be said for these inclusive forms of multilateralism. I chair the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health, which is a network of 1,000 countries, civil society, professional, academic, UN, other international organizations. What's the mandate? To really advocate for women, children, and adolescent health. You also have in the health field the Global Fund, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the UN AIDS Partners Board, all of them based on partnerships that go beyond governments. They include civil society and they also include private sector. So I think, these are examples of where we've managed to be more inclusive, and we need to think, where would there be room for more such initiatives? Because when we think of the UN Charter, starting with the word "we the peoples," it didn't start with "we the member states." It started with "we the peoples," and often we've left the peoples a bit to the side. Now, the third point, encouraged by Marty's kind comments about my own country, which, of course, I won't even call a small power in terms of hard power. There's no power at all. But, of course, there's the power of voice, the power of example. And small countries can make a difference. And I think what's particularly useful for small countries is to be part of issues coalitions, if you like. And I'll give you an example of where an issue coalition is going to be needed in the coming months, and that is around advocacy for reforms in the global health infrastructure, and how wonderful it would be to have a strong set of voices coming out of the Asia Pacific for this, because the Asia Pacific, as we've commented several times, has done significantly better on average, in my opinion, than in general for other regions. So a coalition that's prepared to say, look hard at the independent panel's recommendations, which will be practical and implementable, and I hope bold, and really, organise around advocacy for change, because change doesn't just happen. It needs very committed countries, diplomats, collaboration to move it forward at whatever levels required, whether it's the WHA, whether it's the meeting of the the regional WHO organization headquartered in Manila, whether it's at the level of the UN General Assembly or wherever. And we will need to take the reform message to ASEAN, to APEC, and let's not think that bodies like APEC with a sort of title of Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation only talk about economies. Oh no, they talk about everything that has a bearing on economies. What could have a greater bearing right now than the pandemic? So let's hope that this APEC summit coming up later in the year can also, and the preparation for it, can be a voice for meaningful reform. I remember being the lead speaker at a leaders summit for APEC over a decade ago on the threat of HIV to the economies of the region. So we must really push this reform agenda into the discussions of our regional institutions as well as our global ones, and committed groups of countries, large and small, working together can make a huge difference for that.
Thank you very much, Helen. Yeah, I think very clear. Your 3 sets of points. That we need to reinvigorate multilateralism, but then the how. Always the question is the how. Yeah, this to scale up this inclusive multilateralism. There are a few good examples. Yeah, which is a very comprehensive, in which UN is also part of that. And then how to advance, and how also to push further all these issues, all this reform agenda into the public discourse or the discussion, And then again, to be practical, pragmatic and practical. Of course, we do not want to stop, at the discussion level only, but we want to push this forward. Then again, I'm sure this is based on your experience. Then we need so-called, champion countries, a few countries that, can band together and push the initiatives forward, whether this within the UN system and also with together with the other stakeholder. So in light of that, if I can then take further the conversation in terms of how to push forward this multilateralism, Helen already touched on this inclusive multilateralism. So I would like to ask Pak Marty, and this is also the question posed by the audience, is how about this network multilateralism? As you know, Secretary General already started this public discourse with the UN 75th, the survey, the global survey, and so on. But those were for the issues, the issues, the urgent issues like climate change and so on and so forth. But then second is the mechanism. So therefore, this inclusive multilateralism, basically stakeholders, all stakeholders, not only member states. But then the next question is how about network multilateralism? Pak Marty, this is this idea, this concept is started floating around now. Network multilateralism is multilateralism among the, let's say, global and regional institutions. For example, the UN with ASEAN, UN with PIF, or trilateral UN ASEAN PIF, and all that. I don't know. Can you give insight, on this, how to also effectively maybe a certain theme, based on our experience, we can a little bit get how do you say it, a broad consensus, and can push it a little bit further if the theme or the issues are of common interest. Immediately, no further discussion is on. But in other issues, maybe a little bit need a more intensive discussion before even we can agree. So, Pak Marty, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bu Arminda. And indeed, I have come across the term network multilateralism, as you have just now described. I think that reference, or that allude to the point that I was trying to make earlier, that first and foremost, in terms of what's next, since in my view, there is a deficit of institutional capacities in our region, in the Asia and Pacific. One area where advances can be made is to ensure greater communications, greater network, for want of a better, that could be a term that can be used, between the different pre-existing regional processes. But such a task or such an effort is made all the more possible given the fact that a lot of the issues that many of these regional organizations are concentrated on are actually common to all of them. That's why I made reference to the SDG. I think almost all, probably all regional organizations, processes, etc., would make references to SDG as a priority, as a benchmark. And therefore, I think a conversation and network within or between these regional efforts is not impossible. I think, actually, as a matter of fact, back in 2005, Bu Armida, in Indonesia, in Bandung, when Indonesia commemorated or convened a meeting of the Asia-Africa Conference to commemorate the Asia-Africa Conference, which at the time was in its 30th year since, in 2005, the meeting was between Asia-African regional organizations. It was a meeting between regional organizations, between the secretariat of the regional organizations, their chairs, to compare notes, etc. And as I said before, as well, we have ASEAN-UN cooperation that's quite advanced, and I think this is something that must be facilitated, must continue to be promoted. Essentially, I think the idea is not to reinvent the wheel. The idea is to ensure that there is coherence. Overlapping of efforts is inevitable, cannot be avoided in many circumstances, but how can we ensure that we are as effective and as efficient and in such efforts and by comparing notes? And I think to have such a meeting, not just a meeting, but a process, to be unleashed, I think is extremely useful. It must be, I think, for sake of coherence and for sake of discipline, it must be issue-driven. It must be functional in nature. Otherwise, some organization will come to the meeting and simply self-describe what it's all about, how wonderful organization and effort it is, without any, in a silo. You hear, but you don't really listen to one another. But I think what we need is actually a more integrated, as the Secretary General said, network multilateralism. But to me, that is one challenge. But I keep on coming back, Bu Armida, to the real challenge to me is the national and international. The international actors or partners, you are basically dealing with the converted, people who have the same passion, the same commitment, the same ideas and wanting to contribute. And there is some technical and procedural issues to be ironed out, to be resolved. But what I worry more, what I'm more challenged by, is this chasm or this apparent gap that is now building between the national and the international. Is multilateralism. Ism means it's an outlook. Leadership matters. If leaderships are bereft, if there is not sufficient attention, sufficient commitment at the highest level to what multilateralism is all about, how multilateralism goes hand in hand with national interests, national priorities, then we can see a la carte regionalism. You turn to the region when it suits you, or when it fits with your agenda. But I think you can't switch on and off as you deem convenient. It is a long-term commitment because you never know when you need to turn to the regional or multilateral response. And I think, in the same manner, through the work and commitments of especially the young generation. Look at how climate change have over the years come to the fore, to the public imagination, and the people are moved to wage this effort. In the past, Helen, you would recall, of course, a similar drive against disarmament issues, of which, again, New Zealand was a prime mover. Disarmament issues at one time was agitate all of us, nuclear disarmament issues, to do the right thing. And as a result, because the people were driven, the leadership felt compelled to act. And I think, besides the wonderful interregional networking multilateralism thing that's tremendously important, go ahead. I mean, must be done. The first homework must be at home. Must be at home, at our own national capitals. And I'm hoping that, figures such as Helen, who have been both national figures and global international figures, you are perfectly positioned to make that case, that when we are doing multilateralism, we are also promoting our national interests. It is not differentiated. And I truly feel, Bu Armida, that this is a space that people like yourselves who are listening to, and others who are listening to this forum, we must win the argument. We must win the space. Otherwise, it will be just a conversation among the converted.
Okay, thank you very much, Pak Marty. Very well noted, well taken. So conversation among the converted, right? So we do not want it to be or to stay at that stage. Again, let me see what other questions being posed. Again, one or two is a bit, the question is more practical, maybe, because I'm sure viewers are very much also interested in how to quickly, among others, through this vaccination. So one question is a more practical question is, again, Asia Pacific. This, I think, to Helen, how best or how to scale up, Asia Pacific contribution. Again, President ADB already mentioned Asia Pacific's facts, So apparent already some initiative there, but again, maybe the question is how to scale up this further, because we do not want to wait until years, right, to all get this vaccination completed, So how to scale up further this initiative at the Asia Pacific, to contribute to this. To address this inequitable access to COVID-19 vaccination. Helen, over to you.
Well, look, it's a tough one. In an ideal world, we would have a global allocation mechanism for the vaccine. And that global allocation mechanism would start with a rollout that was rational, that went to all the frontline workers in our borders, in our health systems, and then moved through the vulnerable demographics, the health vulnerable, including the older age groups, and it would move down. Now, we're faced with a situation where, as I said, my country will vaccinate everyone this year. Many high-income countries will, but the prospect right now of that happening for many low and middle income countries is very low. I did a speech 2 weeks ago where I was able to say that of 55 million doses that had been administered at that point, exactly 55 had been in sub-Saharan Africa, and that was in one country, Guinea. I mean, this is shocking. And as I said, if we carry on like this, with those with the means and capacities looking after themselves, we'll never get on top of this disease because it will keep developing its variants, and we'll be like a dog running after its tail. We think we're vaccinated and then a new variant comes from somewhere and we don't have protection against it. So we have to have an equitable approach. Now, as the co-chair of the independent panel, I want to challenge our panelists to really think about what the best mechanism for this is going forward. But we have a situation right now where we need greater equity. and where the COVAX facility started with the very limited ambition of getting the resources to vaccinate 20% of low and middle income country populations. I think the aspiration is now up to 27%, but this isn't good enough. We have to have a comprehensive vaccine ambition. So, as I say, I wonder whether to what extent right now regions should maybe be thinking of taking this into their own hands and using existing coordination mechanisms to club together to work on the more equitable rollout. And as to what vaccine is rolled out, I'm completely agnostic. Whatever the WHO has approved must be seen as an adequate vaccine, regardless of where it emanates from. I did see in some of the discourse about mechanisms the region needed, the question seriously posed as to whether, for example, Southeast Asia, ASEAN needed a CDC, a Communicable Diseases Control Centre. Now that could start some thinking about, well, do we need a mechanism that goes beyond surveillance and alerts to actually being able to work then on rolling out the means to deal with a crisis? I mention ASEAN because it's such a well-developed regional institution with a depth of experience in operating. So those are some thoughts. Just let me add one other relevant thought at the moment. Obviously, in the global panel, we're looking at what are the mechanisms needed to fill the gaps which have been shown from start to finish in the emergence of the virus, its identification as a disease, and then it's becoming a runaway pandemic. And for sure, we can find gaps in the global response. We can find evidence of things that could have gone faster in that December-January period. But what has been absolutely staggering to us is when we look at the chronology and we look at the month of February, we're simply aghast at how much of the world, including the high-income countries in the Northern Hemisphere, sat and watched. And I'm prompted to say this by what Marty said about the need for action at the national level, the need to perceive that, there's a shared interest in acting. And somehow, if countries' leaders and systems aren't going to respond to even a state-of-the-art alert and surveillance system, where are we? We need a demand from our publics for science-led responses, not for denial. And even where there wasn't denial, there was almost like a feeling, oh, well, that's happening over there in East Asia. It can't happen to us. How naive we were. This developed like the 1918 flu pandemic, not like SARS, which was by and large confined in the region, and we dodged a bullet there. So I think, it's really a wake-up call to every country. When you see public health emergency of international concern declared, that means you do something. You don't just watch the TV about what's happening in Wuhan and East Asia. You say, hey, we're living in the 21st century. We're highly globally interconnected. If it's happening there, it's a plane trip away from me and my people. So, cause for reflection as to the national levels of preparedness and anything that ESCAP can do, to sort of link those dots. This is not an abstract concept of how to build resilience in health systems. This is something that's got to be integrated into your national planning framework. And when the alert systems say go, you go. There was an opportunity to avert the disease running away like this, but the month of February's relative inaction in critical parts of the world meant we lost that window. It closed on us. And here we are today, a year after the declaration of the emergency.
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. Before we wrap up, can I go to to Pak Marty, for the final question. This is from the audience, in which one of the audience said that recently we have seen the emergence of geopolitical fractures in our region. For example, in Southeast Asia and also to some extent in the Pacific. And again, how we can effectively navigate through the situation and move beyond. Well, I guess the question is, despite, of course, always all these challenges happening, but despite all this, how we can still move beyond and effectively also address the urgent issues that we discussed so much already. Pak Marty.
Thank you very much, Bu Arminda. I'm conscious of the limitation of time. The several points for me to share. First of all, while we are currently extremely acutely aware of the geopolitical shifts and rifts and gaps and rivalries prevalent in our region and beyond, it is not actually a unique phenomenon. I mean, during ESCAP's existence over the past 75 years, you have had to navigate through all kind of different kind of geopolitical tensions and manifestations of geopolitical rivalries. Geopolitical tensions or dynamics, it's a fact of life. It's not going to go away. It is just the way things are. But I guess how can we develop a multilateral framework that can rise above it, that can somehow take geopolitical rivalries and tensions essentially as a reality, but at the same time ensure that notwithstanding this reality, the effort, the cooperations at the multilateral level can continue to be facilitated and ensured. Now, this is easier said than done. We have been successful in some era and less successful in other era. I think the past 3 or 4 years has been especially challenging because the two key capitals in the world have had especially difficult relationship, and that has emanated elsewhere. I mentioned within the WHO and of course in the most highly politicized forum in the UN Security Council, etc. But I mean, this is where I think countries other than those immediately involved in such geopolitical tensions can rise and can speak more eloquently and more forcefully in favor of multilateralism. I'm not a big fan of terminologies such as small or middle power and major power, because I believe countries' capacity to make a difference is really issue dependent. It's not somewhat preordained. We have a perfect list of who are the most powerful and the least powerful countries, but it is really issue dependent. And I think, notwithstanding the geopolitical rivalries as prevalent, there is space for countries to show alternative script and alternative vision and to reinforce the multilateral message. And that's why I think we need to empower and to give voice and to draw encouragement from these countries, and efforts. Just now, Helen made reference to various global framework approaches. Extremely encouraging to know that these are being promoted and being facilitated. I think that is certainly one way to go. But since geopolitical rivalries have been with us for basically all these times, then the issue is how one can manage and take that into account. And I think it is not impossible. And leadership matters. If the leadership in the capitals of all these countries can influence the agenda and the mood all around us. And I'm hopeful that this will not be in shortcoming in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pak Marty. Also, thank you very much, Helen. I think it's very, very, very enlightening. Yeah, very rich, and maybe I cannot do justice yet to give a summary. But if I may, I would like to try quickly. Several key salient points coming out from the discussion is first is definitely the concern and the focus on the vulnerable groups, because of this poverty, because of this inequality and all the socio-economic impact which being exacerbated especially by this pandemic. Again, on health, on education, therefore the need for the strengthening of a healthcare system, universal healthcare, the social protection, education, and so on. The list goes on. Second is again the climate emergency, but within, of course, is there. It is ongoing, most urgent development challenges. But again, this relationship between people and nature, then everybody revisit again, and how then we can, of course, build back better, but also increase our preparedness, with regard to that, so that ecosystem preservation, restoration comes to the fore. And third is all these dots, Helen keeps reminding us, right? Okay, don't forget these dots, not only nature, not only education, not only health, but please pay attention to the dots, and institutions such as you mentioned, that such as ESCAP is in a good position, to sort of have the overall view of all these dots and how to link the dots, And the next one is, although it's somewhat is, if I can use the term mainstream, this technology innovation and the digital technology, digitalization, but it's understood, This is one of the big force, underway, and in a big way, especially in our region, with the big young population, majority of countries, rising middle class and so on, then it's how do you say it? It's just accelerating. But again, reminding Pak Marty and Helen, this digital divide, And the next one is, of course, President ADB, rightly so, the backbone of our development, progress, despite the challenges, of course, but don't forget also the economy, the value chain, trade, connectivity. Now is broader concept, connectivity, not the conventional connectivity definition, but now to include ICT, to include energy. But remember, mainstream also the resiliency, inclusivity, and sustainability in this trade or value chain and connectivity. And then last is, again, this is still, still in the discussion, and several efforts are, of course, ongoing quite a while, how to push further the very important agenda. Now the term inclusive multilateralism, network multilateralism, these all stakeholders, but also not only the stakeholders, the people, organization, but also across, the multilateral agencies, institutions, regional institutions, and so on and so forth, how to forge this better. Again, one or two issues or points, that came out from the discussion is, push forward based on a certain issue or theme that usually works better, and a few countries, or few stakeholders that can champion the discussion and process forward. So with that, may I then, of course, since we are virtual, but a round of big applause to Helen, to Pak Marty, and also to Mas Hasan, and thanking all of you for your great insight, immense contribution, and we look forward. We will follow up, definitely for our inputs for next year, our commission session, our deliberation with member state countries. But again, also we are already enlarging the discussion here in ESCAP, not only member states together with all relevant stakeholders. So with that, I would like again to thank you, and with my sincerest appreciation. And I close the dialogue for today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.